Hello everyone, welcome. Hello subscribers, thank you. Hello followers. Today I'm going to talk about the future of that the young people have. I've been thinking about this. Obviously they do have a future, but what kind of a future they have? We seem to be at a crossroads now, as if we are experiencing the end of I don't want to say civilization, but the end of an era, and something else completely different is going to start. I have a quote here from an Italian philosopher, Federico Campagna, who says, "Sometimes you are born into the ending of a world. The future no longer works because the future is not going to be the extension of what has come before, but something completely different." And so the attempts to extend that life that came before will no longer work. So he's saying to the young, perhaps, and it has happened throughout history, we are at the end of something, and perhaps what the young will have to do is to get the ruins of what has come before them. Instead of throwing them away or demolishing them altogether, work with those remnants, as it were, of what has come before, and work with that. It took me by surprise, because yes, we tend to think about when we think about the young and their future, we always see it as a continuation of what we have lived. But in some cases, my generation, for example, lived in a civilization, in a cultural situation that proceeded from the one before. But it might be the case that this will no longer be the case for the new generation, and perhaps we realize this. I thought perhaps I'm realizing this a little bit too late, because perhaps this change came already with the technology, these very sudden changes that have occurred, and especially in the last, never mind the technology, in how society and civil society has changed, how we interact with each other and with the government, certainly in the last 4 years. So it's not that they're not going to have a future, but their future, they have to start anew from something that is dying, as all civilizations have died and became something else, and they might have to start anew. I started thinking about the young because I have 2 daughters, and who are American, and my mind always goes back to what is happening in America. I follow the politics, I follow what is going on. I see the polarization in society, and just how the country has changed since I was there 20 years ago. And I'm going to... So the question is, how did it happen? How did we get here? It seems to me that if we complain, or not even complain, if we are aware of the changes that have been made, certainly since the illness, and how our relationship with our leaders has changed, and how perhaps we even feel that we have been let down about what has been happening in the last 3 years, as I said. It is not necessarily that those changes in how our government has treated us, is not that that was something new, is that for that to occur, I think that society had already have to be sort of ready for that. I think that society had already missed something, was already a little bit, let's say, sick. Something was missing from what had come before. We had abandoned already, let me put it very generally, the idea of the sacred, the idea of perhaps even right and wrong to a certain extent. In this postmodernist society, we had perhaps thrown away a lot of what our society, our culture has had been built on. And so we were left a little bit sort of abandoned there. And so society was already sick. It was like a body that is already sick, and therefore it will be easier to be infected. Yes, than if you are in good health. And I don't think our society was already in good health. There was something missing, something that had been thrown away, I think. Now we are fearful, we are confused, we don't know what to do about it, because it just seems that there is very little that each individual can do anything about it, the way things are happening. We might just be very disappointed and say, well, okay, they, with this, the illness and so on, that's the easy route, they played us, or, we've been had or something like that. But we have been made afraid now. But as I said, there was already something amiss there, something lacking in the society, in our lives perhaps, beforehand. And so what is happening because society was already sick, and the virus, the cultural virus, was easy to infect the body. Now, I think a lot of people are looking for something to hold on to. It seems that we are living in quicksand and searching for meaning. And this creates in the whole of society a certain nervousness, an emptiness that then is expressed in depression, mental health issues, which are perhaps derived, a lot of them, not all of course, but a lot of them might be derived from mental boredom and spiritual emptiness. Certainly, life has never been so fleeting as it is today. So are we seeing the end of our civilization? and something completely different is going to come up. Now, how did this come about? Well, you see, when we deny certain things, we do not, certain things in the sense that something that upsets us, something that offends us, something that we don't want to look at it. We were here already. We don't want to look at it, think possibly. We didn't want to deal with them or look at them or acknowledge them because they make us feel uncomfortable, or they were dangerous, or we feel they were dangerous. So in any case, we didn't want to face them. These things, when we don't want to face them, they don't disappear just because we don't want to look at them. Just as in a physical illness, right? Just because you say, oh, well, you know, it's still there, the tumor or whatever it might be. But the thing is that when we do that, when we don't want to look at them, when we don't want to face them, they don't disappear, they actually go inward. We push them underground, but we haven't got rid of them. They are there. And it is true that here they're working in us through different ways, and we are all aware of it. And so now, I don't know whether I'm connecting my thoughts, or whether I'm making a lot of sense. I'm jumping a little bit. But what I'm saying is that we are now living in a space where things cannot be said, for example. And this leads inevitably to fear. And then that fear eventually to resentment, to hatred, and then self-hatred. Let me explain. I'm going to, if you allow me to, just read very quickly just 2 or 3 paragraphs from a book that I'm always bringing books to you. I hope you don't mind. Can you see it? It's the Topology of Violence, and the author is Byung-Chul Han. You're going to ask me, how on earth do you get these books? Well, you see, I go to Oxford, and I go to Blackwell's, and I just spend time there. They have a nice coffee shop, and I just, spend a little bit of time there. And I go with plenty of time, and I look around, and I get all these lovely authors from, I don't know where he is from. I'm sorry. Anyway, and he talks about violence, and let me put it in his words. I just wrote 2 or 3 things, and he's talking about violence when we are able to express it externally. He's not advocating for it, please, nor am I. Just considering the difference of how human beings dealt with anger or anxiety in antiquity, for example, okay, and how we have to deal with it, with the same emotions, in a different way in a civilized society. And he explains this very well, and I just want to read it to you. He says, in the past, the society sanctioned physical violence as a means to an end. It was, as it were, he calls it, a society of blood, distinct, obviously, from a modern society of today, which we could say, or he could say, is, we could call it, instead of blood, of the psyche. In it, in that, in antiquity, when it could be expressed physically, outwardly, he says conflicts were resolved directly through the use of violence, and resolutions were enforced. External violence unburdened the psychic of these people because they could externalize the suffering that they felt, whatever suffering, resentment, anger, the frustration, they could externalize that. So the psychic, as it were, did not have to antagonize itself. The conflict wasn't inside, inwardly. So now, in modernity, he says violence assumes a psychological, internalized form. Destructive energies are not directly, externally, effectively discharged, but rather we have to work them out psychologically, internally. Now, this leads to problems of another kind, as it were. Let me continue reading. He says, in pre-modernity, violence was everywhere. It was visible. Again, he's not saying, let's go back to that. He's just explaining, yes. So it was visible. Power was not merely wielded, but actually put on display. Rulers exhibited their power through deadly violence. Though, well, let me put it this way, through, as he calls it, through blood. Violence was put on display and demonstrated the ruler's power and even his magnificence of the absolute ruler. Yes, in other words, violence was always externalized, and one of the things when the people got very angry or something, then you had the games, or you had the gladiators. So, in other words, power did not conceal itself. It was visible and manifest. It had no shame. It was not silent. In antiquity, he continues saying, the staging of violence was an integral, even central component of communication. In modernity, brutal violence was, of course, the legitimized, and not only on the political stage. Executions or torture now take place in spaces where the general public has no access to. Deadly violence is no longer put on display, obviously. But it has not disappeared. Rather than staging its power and magnificence, it conceals itself in shame. It continues to be wielded, of course, but not publicly staged. Not in the West, anyway. It does not want to draw attention to itself. Do you see where he's going? He says, again, I'm quoting, it shifted from the visible to the invisible, from the direct to the discrete, from the physical to the psychic, from the frontal to the internal. Like a virus, its mode of operation was no longer is no longer confrontation, open confrontation now, but contamination. Not open assault, but concealed infection. He's pointing this out because just to make us aware of how we have to deal with these same emotions that the people in antiquity had. And he goes on to say about different kinds of terrorism and the new technological age. And he says, terrorism does not focus its destructive power frontally, but rather disseminates virally in order to operate invisibly. The cyber wars, for example. This is how war is conducted in the 21st century. And this viral war, this viral violence becomes invisible and non-public. The perpetrators make themselves invisible. Digital viruses, for example, which infect rather than attack, leave hardly any traces that might point out to their perpetrators. So, in other words, he's leading to wanting to tell us that we nevertheless feel attacked in some way, not physically, not a punch on the nose and not, being decapitated, but we nevertheless feel fearful, we feel sometimes under attack, and it is difficult to sort it out psychologically because you cannot defend yourself either, or it feels like it sometimes. He continues, psychological internalization is one of the central shifts of modernity. Violence occurs in the form of conflict with the psychic. Destructive tendencies are carried internally rather than discharged externally. And this internalization of violence also proves useful, by the way, to the ruler or the rulers. It ensures obedience to the external power, and with far less effort, it censors itself. Self-compulsion takes the place of outside compulsion, pretending to be freedom. Did you hear, this comes to mind actually, that those were his words. Did you hear, most of you have heard of the English philosopher Jeremy Bentham, yes? It's the 18th century, beginning of the 19th. And he was an English philosopher during his time, actually better known abroad than in England. Of course, now is someone who every student is aware of, and you have to study him as you do David Hume or Locke or Hobbes or John Stuart Mill. But in his time, he was better known abroad. He was a philosopher, but he was also I believe he was a lawyer. He wrote the constitutions for quite a few countries, as a matter of fact. And he was one of the utilitarians. I won't go into that now, but in one of his travels to Russia, he saw one penitentiary, one jail, and he had the idea, because of what he saw there, he had an idea. He called it the panopticon. And the panopticon was an idea of a prison where, by the way, his idea was never accepted in England, but this was his idea, that instead of having prisoners in the cells as they do still now in corridors, this along this corridor and the other corridor and so on, that it would be a round thing. The cells will be a round building with the guards right here in the middle, and from where they were, they could see absolutely every cell, but the prisoners would not be able to see them. If they were up here, I suppose, the guards would be able to see every single cell and every single prisoner, but the prisoners would not be able to see the guards. But they knew they were there. They just couldn't see them. And so the idea was that because you don't know when you are being watched, you censor yourself because you could be being watched. In other words, he thought that would be actually rather cheap also, because the prisoners would censor themselves just in case they were being watched. And this idea, although Bentham was talking just about a prison, this idea was then taken over by the French philosopher Foucault. You probably heard of him. He is all these critical race theory, they all go back to either Foucault or Derrida, never mind, French. And he used this in order to talk about society, not a prison, but society in general. The idea that we feel that we are being watched or heard, and so we begin to censor ourselves. Let me see what I wrote here. Watchmen cannot be seen, so they don't even need to be on duty, the guards, all of the time. Yeah, that's what I just told you. Okay, so this is perhaps my point is that this is perhaps what is happening today, but that has ramifications when we feel as if we are being watched and we are fearful and we can't express ourselves. And when we cannot, when we cannot express ourselves out of fear, as I said before, it leads that we have to deal with it. That is inside of us. How do we deal with it? Some people deal with it better than others. Some can't deal with it very well, and so we have depression and we have all these mental problems that we see now with our very own eyes. When my little girls were little, I'll tell you a story, because this goes to the technological, how young people now, they don't seem to be able to concentrate or to sit for a long time as we used to do in the past. We had no problems. I was going to mass every day, and there we were, without complaint or but we were able to just sit there. But I remember when my little girls, we were living in Washington D.C. at one point, and I used to take them to a concert of classical music on Sundays. It was free. I don't remember now where it was, but it was right in the center of Washington, D.C., and it was free on, I think it was 3 o'clock on Sundays. And it was quite close to where we used to live. And I remember that whenever the assistants saw me coming with 2 little girls, they were about 4 or 5, they just panicked, because you couldn't obviously take young kids to a concert. And I used to tell them, no, don't worry, they can sit without saying a word, without crying, don't worry. And I would always, just to make them feel comfortable, I would always sit by the door and so on, just for them. But I knew that my little girls would be, and we stayed for the first part, and then we would leave, and the assistants would look at us, and they would come to talk to them. They were very, very surprised, and I'm talking about the very early 90s. And they were already experiencing that young people, perhaps even before the great technological changes, that they were already experiencing that young people, there was a change. Young people could not concentrate as much anymore. But I tell you another story. When they were even littler, we went once, I think it was Christmas time, to see a theater play, Cinderella and the Prince, okay? And they loved it. And then they invited everybody, it was full of kids and parents. And then they invited everybody to go backstage when the play was over, to go backstage, and the kids could meet Cinderella and the Prince. And I don't know why I'm thinking about this now, but it really caught my attention, the fact that all the little kiddies would go. Here was Cinderella and the Prince and everybody, you know, the pages and the kids would go with a piece of paper and a pen and ask for their autograph. They would just go like this, and Cinderella would sign, and then the Prince would sign. I thought it so strange. And I don't know why, but my 2 little girls, obviously they did not have a piece of paper and a pen, and they just looked at them, and they were taking it in, and they said, "Are you really Cinderella? Are you really the Prince?" And they said, "Yes." And they were looking they were looking at the actors like that. In other words, instead of taking a photograph of a snapshot of something, they actually took it in. I don't know, I'm thinking about that now. Because I'm thinking about young people, and I'm thinking about how, I can express it very well, how they will have to deal with the fact that technology is actually, it's going to be a different world because of technology. So I think, yes, they will have to start from, you know, the ruins of the last vestiges of one type of culture and begin the other. I think, just to end, I think that there are so many people who are so lonely, in a sort of a silent despair of some kind, that I think it will be a good idea. Well, I think it will be a good idea to go back to the sacred or the divine, or the mystery, or something that will feed the soul. if you're not religious, it wouldn't matter in this sense. I'm saying that if you have well, it does matter to me anyway, but what I'm trying to say is that if you put in the middle of a big, very busy city, now usually, especially in America, not very beautiful. If you walk around so many cities in Europe, you can still look at these old buildings, and it lifts you up, the beauty of these places. In America, there are many cities, the ones that, I think I said this already, the ones that were built after the automobile, that they are not pretty. The older ones, but not the new ones. And if you were to put someone was actually telling me about it, a church with they were talking about a Catholic church which is saying the Mass, the old Mass with all the ritual and so on. And people, even non-religious people, actually go there and sit there just to absorb or drink some mystery, something beyond themselves. I think this is what a lot of people are missing. Perhaps they're missing God, a belief in God, and they're looking for it. They're looking for God. They're looking for divine everywhere. I leave you there because otherwise I'll go into a sermon and I don't want to do that. Okay, please subscribe and like the little thing, and you make sure that you get your notifications, because I don't think all the of late not all the subscribers get the notifications. So anyway, if you can help at all with the channel, I appreciate it. Thank you so much. Bye bye.